Chancellor Sajid Javid has resigned. Now that is a pretty shock piece of news. Certainly it was expected that he would be staying in post, that he was one of that group of ministers in the most senior offices of state who would be staying in that position. But we are hearing now from our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, that he in fact has resigned. This is Laura's tweet I'm reading to you. I don't know if we can get it up on the screen straight away, but she was saying, so Javid has gone, reshuffle blown up. If this is a carefully worked out jigsaw of people in particular positions, then to lose someone as key as him from a key position clearly means that Boris Johnson will have to some extent, go back to the drawing board. There is Laura's Twitter feed on your screens. Laura says she hears that Sajid Javid was offered to stay on as Chancellor on condition he fired all of his advisors. He refused and turned down the job. So it sounds as though the Chancellor was certainly railing against being told what to do with his personal advisors. And we can now talk to Laura, our political editor. Laura, this is a quite extraordinary piece of news, a quite extraordinary development.
It really is. I mean, reshuffles so often end up blowing up and being very unexpected. In the last few minutes, I've heard that the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, has decided that rather than obey the orders of the Prime Minister to sack his advisory team, he has instead turned down the second most important job in government and has decided to resign. In the interim, I'm just hearing that Rishi Sunak, who has been the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, is likely to be appointed Chancellor in his place. But that job of being Boris Johnson's next-door neighbour at number 11 was meant to be, in number 10's design, a piece of continuity. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, was meant to be staying on despite the fact that there had been unhappiness between the two teams, as there so often is here in Downing Street. But this is a really major development and a big difference to the government because, of course, the Chancellor is one of the key appointments, perhaps the most important appointment that any Prime Minister makes. And at this early stage of the morning, only a couple of hours into the reshuffle, it has already taken an unexpected turn. I'm just turning there to Dominic Raab. What do you make of the Chancellor having to resign, Dominic Raab? Of course, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, expected to stay there in that job, but no doubt this will all be blown off course now. What had been expected to be a reshuffle of relatively moderate scale, not too much drama going on, has already turned into something extremely different.
So obviously, Laura, an attempt to exert a huge degree of control down to, control over who individual ministers' advisors would be. So where was that request coming from? Obviously, yes, from the Prime Minister, but who was behind that? Was it Boris Johnson? Anyone else behind that request to Sajid Javid to fire all of his advisors?
Well, without having been in the room, and it's always hard to tell, but of course I think the finger will point, either fairly or not, but pretty directly at Dominic Cummings, who's the Prime Minister's most senior advisor. That is, I think, an assumption that a lot of people will make. But, that said, there are a lot of people who work in Downing Street, and ultimately it is ministers and prime ministers who make the decision. As the saying goes, advisors advise, prime ministers decide. But it is, quite an extraordinary thing to happen at this stage of a relatively new government, not long after the election, that essentially the number two in terms of those top jobs, the man who was in charge of the economy, who was meant to be delivering a budget in less than a month's time. The budget is in 4 weeks on March the 11th. Rather than staying in government, has refused to stay in that hugely important job because he would not accept an attempt to exert more control on him by Downing Street. And ultimately, there's always gossip and chat about advisors and how they behave, but ultimately, Prime Ministers are the ones who make the decisions. Boris Johnson may have hoped that Sajid Javid would just suck this up and stay on. Quite clearly, he's decided that's just not going to be the case. And so therefore, we have a big elevation for Rishi Sunak, who was considered in Conservative circles as somebody who was a rising star, who proved himself during the general election campaign. But for someone with a relatively little level of experience, very well respected in Westminster, I would say, but still, a relatively new member of the government, a huge elevation for him, an enormous pressure. And, this is the kind of thing, changing the Chancellor is not a decision that any government would ever take lightly. And to lose the Chancellor over this sort of power struggle over who's on his payroll is a very, very big political call to make. But some people might remember very early days, one of Sajid Javid's special advisors, Sonia Khan, was fired at that point by the new number 10 operation. Sajid Javid made no secret of the fact that he was deeply unhappy about that, and he has refused to allow that to happen again, instead deciding that it's time to move out.
So, Laura, as far as number 10 is concerned, then the pace of the day, the pace of the reshuffle continues.
Yes, that's absolutely. And forgive me for just checking down at my phone because I don't want to miss anything happening. So, but just as I understand it, this is a big turn in the reshuffle. We were expecting this to be relatively mid-scale, relatively move along, not that much to see. Yes, some well-known names like Andrea Leadsom and Esther McVeigh departing the government. But in terms of the overall setup and the overall direction, as I was saying, with a budget in 4 weeks, this was not meant to be how the day was meant to progress. But they certainly have found themselves relatively early in the day with a huge drama unfolding. Of course, people will point at this and wonder if number 10 really thought that Sajid Javid would accept this attempt to exert huge control over him and his wider team. Maybe they believe that actually he would end up resigning because of that. But, as the hours unfold and the days unfold, then, we'll try and be able to find out exactly what went on. But no doubt, a reshuffle that's already taken a very different turn from what we expected just 10 minutes or so ago.
And my reaction to this, I'm sure a lot of people's reaction, as you heard me say a second ago, was what an extraordinary piece of news. I mean, Laura, this is a chancellor who didn't actually even get to deliver a budget.
Well, I mean, look, this is a relatively, new government. That's how they want to cast themselves. But Sajid Javid was absolutely meant to be part of that team. There have already been some big set-piece announcements from him, and we know, for example, that he was very keen on getting that high-speed rail 2 announcement over the line. Of course, that happened last week. But it's not just a matter of a budget in a few weeks' time. Also, the government's been embarking on what's known as the spending review round, where literally, line by line, every pound and penny that's spent by the government is meant to be looked at and put under the microscope. And, chancellors are traditionally, of course, absolutely key to the shaping of any government and its priorities, but also very often the tension between those two buildings behind me, between numbers 10 and 11, is very often a defining characteristic of any government. And that certainly had been rumbling around for a long time. Tensions not necessarily between Boris Johnson and Sajid Javid individually, but certainly between their teams. But this turn of events, I think will really be quite shocking to some people. One Tory insider has just texted me a couple of moments ago, I just saw when I glanced down at my phone, saying this is insane. Sajid Javid was stability in the government that, we'll only know in the weeks and months to come whether or not Rishi Sunak is able to step up to the plate. He's somebody who's widely respected in Westminster, but it's a huge step up for him. And also, what kind of role will Sajid Javid play on the back benches? Will he become, as people often do, a thorn in the Prime Minister's side? Of course, with the parliamentary majority the size of Boris Johnson's, it's not really the case that he's in any way under threat, but he could do without ardent critics, and we'll have to wait and see what Sajid Javid decides to do on the back benches. Remember too, he wanted to be Prime Minister, he ran for the leadership as well. So this is really sort of setting the cat among the pigeons, and it may well be the start of something rather than the end of one man's political time in cabinet.
OK, Laura, thank you very much for that. Laura Kunsberg in Downing Street for us. Laura saying that Sajid Javid has decided that rather than obey the orders of the Prime Minister to sack his advisory team, he has instead turned down what is regarded as the second most important job in government.